Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on something I know a lot of you have been asking about, and that's using ozone to remove these things called micropollutants from wastewater.
Oh, yeah.
And to help us unpack all of that, we have an expert joining us today.
Absolutely happy to be here.
We'll be looking at a 2013 research article titled Prediction of Micropollutant Elimination During Ozonation of Municipal Wastewater Effluents, Use of Kinetic and Water-Specific Information by Lee and a whole bunch of other researchers.
Right.
And what's really cool about this study is that it wasn't just done in one lab, like a lot of studies are.
Yeah.
They actually tested ozone treatment on wastewater from 10 different plants across 3 continents, Australia, Switzerland, and the U.S.
Wow, that's a really robust study then.
Yeah, so the findings are pretty robust and likely apply to a variety of situations.
Absolutely. It's a great study to look at because it provides a global perspective on using ozone for this specific purpose.
Okay, so before we jump into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a quick, what are micropollutants? Why should we care about them?
Yeah, so micropollutants are essentially contaminants that are found in wastewater. But the catch is they're present in very, very low concentrations.
Okay.
We're talking nanograms per liter or micrograms per liter.
Okay.
And that might sound tiny, but even at these low levels, they can still pose risks to aquatic life and potentially to human health.
So they're like the ninjas of the wastewater world.
Exactly. They kind of slip under the radar.
Yeah.
And to make things even trickier, conventional wastewater treatment methods often don't remove these effectively.
Oh, really?
They're really designed to handle the bigger pollutants,
Right.
the things we can easily see and measure. But these micropollutants, they kind of slip through the cracks.
So that's where ozone comes in.
Exactly. That's where ozone comes in as a potential solution.
I was reading that ozone is being hailed as a potential solution.
Yes.
But why ozone? What makes it so special for tackling these micropollutants?
Well, ozone is a powerhouse when it comes to oxidation.
Okay.
It's really good at breaking down other compounds, especially the tough organic molecules that make up a lot of these micropollutants.
Interesting.
So you can kind of think of it like a molecular wrecking ball, smashing those contaminants into smaller, less harmful pieces.
I like that analogy, the wrecking ball.
Yeah,
But does ozone attack all micropollutants equally?
that's where things get a little more interesting.
Mm.
The study points out that there's actually 2 main ways that ozone works its magic.
Okay.
The first is a direct attack. So ozone itself can react with certain micropollutants and break them down.
Okay.
And this is particularly effective against compounds that have what chemists call electron-rich moieties.
Electron-rich moieties.
Yeah, don't let the fancy terms scare you.
Okay.
Basically, think of them like little magnets on a molecule that make it really easy for ozone to attach and break the molecule apart.
So like ozone has a specific taste.
Yeah, you could say that it's kind of a picky eater. But there's a second way it works too, and this is a little bit less direct. When ozone reacts with water and other substances in the wastewater, it creates these things called hydroxyl radicals.
Okay.
And these hydroxyl radicals are denoted by the symbol .OH, and they're less selective, and they can attack a wider range of micropollutants.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a
It's like a 1-2 punch.
a double attack.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see why it's so promising,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking, okay, if you're looking at wastewater from 10 different plants,
Right.
wouldn't the water composition vary?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
Does that affect how well this works?
Yeah, and that's something the researchers addressed directly in this study.
Okay.
They introduced this concept of a specific ozone dose.
Specific ozone dose.
Yeah, and it's basically the amount of ozone added relative to the amount of dissolved organic carbon in the wastewater.
Okay.
And it's measured in grams of ozone per gram of what we call DOC, dissolved organic carbon.
Oh.
And it's basically a way to normalize the ozone dosing across different water sources.
Well, you're comparing apples to apples.
Exactly. You're making sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Yeah.
Because the water coming into these different plants is going to have different amounts of organic matter.
Right.
So if you just dose the same amount of ozone into each one, you're not really getting a fair comparison.
Makes sense.
So they use this specific ozone dose to make sure they're comparing things properly. And when they applied this concept across all the different plants, they found a really interesting pattern.
Okay, I'm hooked. What did they find?
Well, they found that micropollutants that had a high reactivity to ozone, remember those electron-rich moieties we talked about?
Yeah, those magnets.
Yeah, exactly, those magnets. They were eliminated really efficiently, even at low specific ozone doses.
Wow.
We're talking over 90% removal at a dose of just 0.25 grams of ozone per gram of DOC.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it is.
But what about the micropollutants that don't react as well with the ozone directly?
Right, so are they just stuck in the water?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Remember those hydroxyl radicals, the cleanup crew I was talking about?
Yes, the 1-2 punch.
Exactly. So the study found that even those micropollutants that don't react so well with ozone directly can still be eliminated if they're susceptible to those hydroxyl radicals.
Oh, interesting.
It might require a higher specific ozone dose
Oh,
to make sure there are enough radicals being generated, but it's still a viable option.
so it's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. You got finding that balance where you're targeting both the ozone reactive and the hydroxyl radical susceptible micropollutants.
And this is where the study takes an even deeper dive.
Yeah.
They found out something fascinating about the predictability of ozone treatment.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about after the break, so stay tuned. Predictability. You really got me on the edge of my seat here. Tell me more.
Well, they found that you can actually predict how well ozone is going to clean up your wastewater if you know a few key things.
Makes sense.
And we've already talked about one of them,
Yeah.
the specific ozone dose.
Right.
But there are a couple other factors that come into play.
Okay, so what are those other factors?
So the second factor is the micropollutants reaction rate constants with both ozone and those hydroxyl radicals.
Okay.
And those are denoted as KO3 and K.OH, respectively.
Okay.
And these constants basically tell us how quickly a particular micropollutant will react with either ozone or a hydroxyl radical.
So it's all about speed.
Exactly. It's like, knowing the speed of two runners in a race.
Yeah.
If one runner is way faster than the other, you can pretty much bet on who's going to win.
Right.
So similarly, if a micropollutant reacts really quickly with ozone or hydroxyl radicals, we can predict that it's going to be eliminated more effectively.
So specific ozone dose and reaction rate constants. Got it? Anything else?
Yes, one more piece of this puzzle.
Okay.
Something called hydroxyl radical exposure.
Hydroxyl radical exposure.
And this measures how many of those reactive hydroxyl radicals are actually present and available to react with the micropollutants.
So it's not just how fast they can react, but also how many of them are actually there to do the job.
Exactly. It's like having a whole bunch of workers, but only a few tools to work with.
Right.
You're not going to get much done.
So how do you even measure something like that?
Well, the researchers used a pretty clever trick. They used what's called a probe compound,
Okay.
called p-chlorobenzoic acid, or PCBA for short.
TCBA.
And this compound doesn't react directly with ozone,
Okay.
but it loves to react with hydroxyl radicals.
Interesting.
So by measuring how much of that PCBA is degraded during the ozone treatment, they could indirectly determine the hydroxyl radical exposure.
So that's pretty ingenious, like a little chemical detective sniffing out the hydroxyl radicals.
That's a great way to put it.
So what they found was that the higher the specific ozone dose, the greater the hydroxyl radical exposure.
Right, which makes sense. The more ozone you add, the more of those radicals you're going to generate.
So let me just make sure I've got this straight. We can predict how well ozone treatment will work by looking at the specific ozone dose, the reaction rate constants of the micropollutants, and the hydroxyl radical exposure, which we can measure using that PCBA trick.
You got it.
Did I miss anything?
Yep, you got it all.
Okay, good.
And that's really useful for designing and optimizing ozone treatment processes.
Okay.
So instead of just, throwing ozone at the problem and hoping for the best,
Right.
we can actually use this knowledge to estimate how well a particular micropollutant is going to be removed. And that means we can tailor the treatment to specific water sources and really target particular contaminants for removal.
This is really exciting stuff. It seems like ozone could be a total game changer in cleaning up our wastewater.
It certainly has huge potential. And the more we understand about how it works, the more effectively and efficiently we can use it to make our water cleaner and protect the environment.
So are there any downsides to using ozone?
Well, as with many things, it's not a perfect solution. While ozone is incredibly powerful at breaking down those micropollutants, it can also produce some potentially harmful byproducts during the treatment process.
Like,
Some common ones include bromate, which can form when ozone reacts with bromide that's naturally present in some water sources.
okay.
And there are also nitrosamines, which are known to be carcinogenic.
So there are some trade-offs to consider.
Exactly. It really highlights the need for more research to really get a handle on these byproducts and how we can mitigate those risks.
So what are some ways we can mitigate those risks?
Well, there are a couple of promising avenues we can explore.
Okay.
One is to really try to optimize the ozone dose and the treatment conditions to kind of minimize the formation of those byproducts while still effectively removing the micropollutants.
Okay.
Another option is to incorporate additional treatment steps like activated carbon filtration to remove any byproducts that do form.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach. You
Exactly.
got to be really strategic about it.
Yeah, it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution.
This all sounds really promising, though. It seems like we're on the right track with this ozone technology.
I think so. It's
Yeah.
definitely a step in the right direction.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from what those tiny micropollutants are to how ozone can help us remove them.
Yeah, we have.
But I'm sure our listeners still have some questions. What are some things you think they might be wondering about?
That's a great question. The study itself focused on, specific micropollutants and specific water sources.
Yeah.
But you might be wondering how things would change in different situations.
Right.
Like, what if your local water source is high in pharmaceuticals?
Yeah.
Or what about the role of temperature or pH? These are all factors that could potentially influence how effective ozone is.
Those are great questions.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of research. It often sparks even more questions.
It definitely does. Well, I think it's time for us to surface from this deep dive.
I agree.